Welcome to this episode of the Sports Detective Podcast Show. My name is James Williams, and today we have seismic college football news because Nick Saban is calling it quits. Yes, Nick Saban is retiring after 17 seasons with Alabama. He won 6 national championships. You can go over all the stats. You can, if you want to hear a talk about his legacy, if you want to hear, how great of a coach he was, all of the stats are insane. Unfortunately, this is not the show for that. This is a show where I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to be talking about how shocking of a retirement that this was, the urgency that Alabama has to fill this role. We're going to talk about the pros and cons of this job opening, and then we're going to kind of go over a few of the candidates that are being talked about right now as potential successors to the heir of the Alabama Nick Saban throne. So to start off here, this was a very shocking retirement. We knew it was going to happen at some point. We knew that probably anytime this was going to happen, it was going to be shocking. But it's also shocking because they had their DC Steele. He retired a few weeks ago. I don't know if it was a few weeks or maybe a few days ago. I don't know the exact timeline on that. But Nick Saban was very active in trying to help fill that position. So that was a little odd. He was also very active the last few weeks in the transfer portal, trying to get more talent to Alabama. He's also obviously been active in recruiting. So this was coming a little bit of a shocking because of those certain stats. Also, this Alabama team is still very, very good. He can still win a national championship next year if he were to have stayed. So, with all of that being said, it was kind of shocking, but you also do kind of understand he is getting up there. Is what's for next for Nick Saban? It looks like it's not a mistake that one ESPN asks him to come on college football, game day and the pregame shows when it comes to national championship time if he's not in it. And that's because college game day, and it's not a coincidence Nick Saban goes on, there is a little bit of a mutual interest that Saban could be on college game day next year. And I'm not going to talk about that much, but I'm just going to kind of leave that little nugget there. Is people are saying what's next for Nick Saban? It looks like it might be something along that line where he's working in television to some capacity. As far as the urgency for this job to be filled, Alabama needs to very much move fast on this hiring. And here is why. Excuse me. I follow a lot of SEC people. I've talked to a lot of SEC people doing the show for a few years now. And because of that, I've been noticing them talking about stuff on Twitter. And every other SEC school right now is having the same conversation. Who can we pick off that coaching staff? And more importantly, who can we pick off that roster now that Nick Saban's gone? And the longer and longer that Alabama waits to fill this hiring. Now, I'm not saying they should fill it within the next half hour. I'm recording this 1:30 Central Time Thursday. I'm not saying they should fill it within the next hour. And I did hear Bruce Feldman on the Ryan Russillo show. They recorded it yesterday that Alabama their plan is to try and fill this opening within the next 72 hours. So probably before all the NFL playoff games are done this weekend, Alabama should have their next head coach, or at least that is their plan right now. But I'm telling you right now, the SEC schools, maybe even the bigger schools like in Ohio State, Oregon, Washington, the teams that are competing for national championships are going to try their best to try and steal just even one player off this roster because it is still one of the most talented rosters in all of college football, without a doubt. And that is one, we'll just go ahead and transition from that into the pros and cons of this job. And that is one of the pros of this job. This isn't a rebuild. This is if the roster stays intact the way it is, whoever comes in to be the head coach next year has the talent, has the resources to win a national championship year one. That was a thing last year when people were saying, well, Alabama is going to go 9-3, or after the Texas loss in the UCF game where they struggled, or did I say USF game where they struggled? The thing I always kept going back to was like, hey, you can say that, and I know it hasn't looked that good, but if you just look at the pedigree of this roster, it is still one of the best in the country, if not, number one or number two. If it was number two, it'd be number two to Georgia. If you're just looking at them out, 5 stars, 4 stars on this list or on this roster. So that's one pro. Another pro is that, as we've seen, obviously, over the last 17 years, Alabama is willing to commit the resources financially since the NIL has been a thing through NIL. They've been willing to commit to the resources, the money, and just the commitment of an athletic department, of a community to winning national titles. So if you go and become the head coach of Alabama, you know that they are going to do everything that they can to try and compete for national titles every single year. With that being said, too, our other pro that we have here, and it's mostly because of Nick Saban, that the Alabama has one of the most recognizable college football brands, pedigrees across the entire country. Everyone knows who Alabama football is. Everyone knows that iconic A, the Crimson Tide. It's very much has the pedigree of, probably you could say, the best brand, quote unquote, in college football. So that's another reason. But there's also a lot of reasons of why maybe people wouldn't want to take this job. Obviously, a lot of people are going to want to. A lot of people would love to be the head coach of Alabama, but there's also a lot of people that might be in good situations right now that might be a little bit scared to take this job. Um, Part of the reason is you're going to be replacing Nick Saban. And if you care about your legacy at all, replacing Nick Saban is impossible, because it is nearly impossible to replicate his success. I'll go over a few goals here. He obviously won 6 national titles. He's won the most national titles ever out of any college football coach, I'm pretty sure. He did 6 in 12 years. Basically, every year he's pumping out first round draft picks, defense and offense. It is just an impossible. And because he was so successful, it's kind of, in a way, created this impossible standard where if you come and you don't win a national title within, let's say, the first 3 or 4 years, your butt might be on the street and you might be taking a contract buyout, because that is the standard that Nick Saban has created there. And that's a downside of this job. It's an impossible standard where if you're not holding yourself up, like we see it a little bit with Ryan Day at Ohio State, where Urban Meyer won one national title in, like, I think he was there like 8 or 9 years at Ohio State. I'm sorry if it was only 7. But Ryan Day's won like 90% of his games at Ohio State. Now he's not on the hot seat, but it's starting to get a little bit warm. Ohio State fans are getting feeling a little bit, making Ryan Day feel a little bit of discomfort in his head coaching position. And even though, last year he was a field goal away from playing in the national championship game, they're beating, again, they're winning 90% of their games. And if that's how they feel at Ohio State, what do they feel at Alabama if somebody does, like, basically is, very much good, but isn't beating, let's say, Georgia in the SEC championship game and is getting to a Final Four of a playoff, but then isn't getting to the championship game and not winning the championship game? How are Alabama fans going to feel about that? Again, it's not fair, but that's just the way it is. Yeah, and basically because of that, too, I kind of pointed at it earlier, if you have that high of a standard, your job security might not be as good as maybe as it is where you're going, or as it is where you are. We'll go over some of those candidates here in a little bit. Just a few names like Dan Lanning at Oregon, Lane Kiffin at Ole Miss. Just a few guys kind of like Kalen DeBoer at Washington. Like you're going to have to win more consistently there or at Alabama than you would there. Another thing here too, and this is probably the most interesting point or con. It's a potential con, and it's a kind of an unanswerable question. Is Alabama such a prestigious school and job because of Nick Saban? Did Nick Saban make it prestigious? And maybe he was such a great coach that he elevated Alabama, which he obviously did. But because of that, does that maybe make this job a little bit less desirable? So those are kind of the pros and cons there. I know I might have offended a lot of Alabama fans here in the first 9 minutes. Not trying to, just trying to be realistic about this. So let's go ahead and just talk about, I have a tweet here from Dan Thompson. I have no idea what site this is from, but, and I don't know how accurate take this with a grain of salt. Here are the current odds, or this was posted yesterday. Things have probably changed since then. Current odds for people to replace Nick Saban in Alabama. Now, I want to say this right off the bat. I don't agree with this list. I think there's some people here that, one, Alabama isn't interested, and I also think there's some people here that might not be interested in Alabama. So I want to say that right off the bat. But let's just kind of go through this list here. Dan Lanning has been the number one name that you have been hearing all around college football for the next Alabama job. It's unclear how much interest Lanning has in that job, but without a doubt, Lanning is on Alabama's top 2 or 3 list right now. So he is the number one option for Alabama right here. A few things about Lanning here. So the reason why Alabama might want him: one, he's been good at Oregon. Two, he was Kirby Smart's DC, so he has SEC ties, which is very important to SEC hirings when they make their hirings. Hold on, I'm going to take a drink of water here for a second. And that's very much important to SEC schools. It's like, hey, do you have ties to us? Do you have ties to this area? Do you know the area? Do you know how to recruit? Oh, another thing here about Dan Lanning. And now this is going to be a very important question here as to how badly a factor in getting Dan Lanning to Alabama. One, how badly does Dan Lanning want to go to Alabama? And more importantly, how badly does Alabama want Dan Lanning? Because here's the thing, guys. And someone said this to me about Oregon. It was someone out west. To me, it was a little bit of a hater syndrome when they said it to me, but I do think there's some truth to it. Where if you look at the past Oregon coaches over the last 15 years, Chip Kelly, Willie Taggart, and Mario Cristobal, all of them eventually, this is the negative way if you wanted to look at it. The negative way to look at it is they used Oregon as a stepping stone job. They used that as the job to get the job. Chip Kelly obviously left Oregon to go to the NFL, Willie Taggart to Florida State, Mario Cristobal to Miami. So because of that, Florida is not dumb. Or excuse me, not Florida. Oregon is not dumb. They know that. They know that their coaches left for better jobs. So what they worked into Dan Lanning's contract when he signed it was they made it to have like a very much because again, if teams end up stealing another team's coach, they have to pay some sort of a buyout. So that they can buy Dan Lanning out of his contract. So right now it's reported that Dan Lanning, his buyout is $20 million. So you would have to pay $20 million to get him out of his contract. Plus, if you're hiring Dan Lanning and really getting him to leave Oregon, is it a 10 year, 8 year, $100+ million contract to get him to Alabama? It has to be something like that, right? So you're talking about 130, 140 maybe $1 million commitment. So that's a very much a bigger financial commitment. So if Alabama is very much set on Dan Lanning, they might pay that $20 million. Now I've heard too. I heard Bruce Feldman say this on the Ryan Russillo show. I'll reference that again. That he thinks that even though that's reported to 20 million, he thinks it might be way more than that. And if there's potential that it's way more than that, Alabama might just be like, hey, we like Dan Lanning, but it's not worth to pay that buyout plus another contract. Even though money might not be much of a factor to them, it might be a little bit of a factor to be like, you know what, maybe we're not in love with them. Maybe we'll go to our second and third options. Dabo Swinney's not getting the Alabama job because the Alabama people very much want somebody that is adapting to the current rules of college football. We know Dabo has the Alabama connections, but the fact that he is very adverse to trying to get people out of the transfer portal and accepting NIL as a reality, he's not going to be the next head coach. Lane Kiffin is interesting because Lane Kiffin is all of that stuff. Lane Kiffin is very active in NIL. He is very active in the transfer portal. He has Alabama ties. He was an offensive coordinator. The interesting thing about that, though, is if Nick Saban is involved in the coaching search at all, and if Alabama cares at all about Nick Saban's opinion, Lane Kiffin's probably not getting that job because I don't think Nick Saban and Lane Kiffin like each other that much. Every year before Ole Miss would play Alabama, Lane Kiffin would always have some weird quote where he's poking the bear, which I don't understand why, because a few years ago they like smacked the crap out of Ole Miss. Last year's game was a little bit close, but Alabama still beat them by like 2 touchdowns. But Lane Kiffin's an interesting thing because Ole Miss isn't necessarily, they don't have a terrible history, but they don't have like an elite history as a football program. And he has basically kind of rose the standard there. He's getting paid very well there. He's done a good job at Ole Miss. Kalen DeBoer, I think, would be an awesome hire. I'm not sure how realistic it is. I think it would be more likely DeBoer leaves for an NFL job than it is he leaves for a Alabama. One, he doesn't have any SEC ties. And two, I think he'd be a better. I think he'd be a good NFL head coach. So I do think it would be an awesome hire if they were to get him. And if you're Kalen DeBoer, maybe you think like, hey, I almost won a national championship this year at Washington. I know the national championship game, you can say it's not that close, but they were in a 5-point spread before that game kicked off, and you could say, hey, we're going to the Big Ten. I got to the national championship game in year 2. What's it going to be like in year 5? And I can kind of have less of a microscope under me if I stay in Washington, and I can still have chances to compete for a national championship. So I don't think that's a realistic possibility. Deion Sanders, I don't think Deion Sanders is going to Alabama. One, because I think he would want to bring his kids, and I just think there's a lot of moving pieces when it comes to Deion leaving Colorado. I do think he will leave Colorado eventually. This isn't an anti-Deion thing, by the way. I like Deion. I started watching the Amazon Prime Colorado season on uh, Amazon. If you are a fan of like sports documentaries, if you're a fan of Hard Knocks or the Last Chance U stuff that was on Netflix, watch that. You will enjoy it. You will enjoy it. It is awesome. Pat Shermer, no, not even gonna entertain that one. It'll be funny if he's actually the head coach. Urban Meyer, I have a hard time believing Urban Meyer would leave his TV job or whatever to go to Alabama. But this is how you sell it to Urban Meyer. Hey, man, this, unlike Ohio State, unlike when you went to Florida, you don't have to rebuild anything here. You just kind of come, maintain the culture, maintain the recruiting, maintain the NIL, and you come and you just got to coach and win national titles. That's a pretty good pitch for Urban Meyer. Billy Napier, this is what makes me feel like this isn't a realistic list. Billy Napier's going to get fired by Florida later this year. He is not a realistic candidate for this job. Derek Dooley. So who's Derek Dooley? I didn't know this. He's a offensive analyst. He's been a head coach at Alabama right now. He's been a head coach at Louisiana Tech, I believe, and Tennessee. Other than that, he's been kind of an assistant in a lot of places. So I assume his name is on the list because, again, I don't know this for a fact. So sorry, maybe Alabama people can, if you're listening to this, still listening to this, if I didn't drive you away already, maybe say something in the chat. It feels like the reason he is on this list is that, like, if for some reason they needed an interim head coach this past season, maybe he would be the guy. Again, I'm not 100% sure on that point, but I also think that's very unlikely. Here is probably the net if you're ranking these guys of likelihood being the next head coach. You'd make, based off this list, you'd be Dan Lanning 1, Kiffin 2, then DeBoer, Meyer 3, but I think this guy's actually higher. This guy's probably third on this list here, if not second. Mike Norvell. Mike Norvell, head coach of Florida State, took them to a 13-0 season this year, completely turned around that program. Florida State was in an awful, awful place from a football perspective when Norvell took over. He's been an excellent recruiter there. A lot of guys are going to the NFL this year from that team. That's part of the reason why they got smashed by Georgia, is because all these awesome guys that he helped develop and bring in basically opted out for the what was that bowl game they played? Was that the Orange Bowl? I think they were the Orange Bowl. And because of that, that's why they got smashed. But Mike Norvell, still an awesome head coach. He'd be a good hire for Alabama. I mean, if the other guys say no, I think he'd be a solid hire. With that being said, with Mike Norvell, different than Dan Lanning, Mike Norvell's buyout is like $2 or $3 million to buy him out of his contract. That's like nothing. That's like nothing. That's just like a bonus or something. You could write it off as that. So I think Mike Norvell could be an interesting option. Ryan Day is there at the bottom. I don't think Ryan Day is a realistic option. But again, if you're talking about options that weren't on that list, I have two. I've been talking for 20 minutes, so we're just going to kind of wrap this up here. Also, too, if people have other suggestions that weren't on that list and I haven't discussed here or I'm about to discuss, please leave a comment and of someone you might think that's an interesting kind of hire. Two other names that I heard. One would be Sark. I'm surprised Sark isn't on that list. If you have like Urban Meyer on that list, you don't have Sark on that list. You have Brian Day ahead of Sark. Sark, as we know, helped Alabama win a national championship as an OC. probably had helped coordinate one of the better offenses in college football history at Alabama. So he has the Alabama ties. He's done a phenomenal job at Texas, got them to the playoff this year, Big 12 championship this year. I don't think he's going to take that job because I think he thinks that, like, hey, I can compete and win national titles at Texas. The fact that Texas is going to the SEC, I also think kind of solidifies Sark staying at Texas. So I don't think that's a realistic option. This will be the last option that I will throw out, and then we'll go ahead and leave. Mike Vrabel, fired by the Tennessee Titans. He was a player at Ohio State for a while. He coached at Ohio State for a while. And when he coached at Ohio State, he was considered to be a pretty good recruiter. We know that he's a pretty darn good head coach from what we've seen him in the NFL. Is there a chance that Alabama just says, hey, we're going to kind of go out of left field and get Mike Vrabel? I think that's an interesting option. It is a little bit of a riskier option because we haven't seen Mike Vrabel, coach college football and run a college football program as the head of it. So I do think that was an interesting option, but I think that's going to do it for this discussion here. I've been talking for like 21 minutes. So if you like this video, please hit that subscribe button. Please hit that like button. And again, leave me comments if you think, who do you think would be the best for this job? If there's someone I didn't name, if there's someone I did name, just throw out any names you possibly can. Thank you guys very much for watching. My name is James Williams. I've been doing this podcast show for over 4 years now. We're just now starting to put clips like this on YouTube. I've interviewed college football people from all over the country. I've done 50 plus interviews of people talking college football, of reporters from Pac-12, Big 12, SEC, ACC. What's the other conference? Big 10. You can tell I live in Iowa, so Big 10. I'm an Iowa State person in Iowa, so I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of the Big 10. So yeah, if you like stuff like that, I'd also talk NFL, NBA, college basketball. So if you like all that stuff, please hit subscribe, hit that like button, really helps support the show. And thank you very much for watching. I'll talk to you next time.